The first three lectures in this series have claimed, first, that contemporary art is not something to be tested against Hegel, but rather something to which his writing is essentially exposed. Second, that this means, in part, that we have to grasp such art as made not within the terms of a realized system, but out of complex acknowledgments of what continues to be at play within and across them. And third, that our stakes in art don't go apart from our larger stakes in the world and one another. Contemporary, as I'm using the term, both does and does not pick out some particular period. It is a way of rendering what Hegel calls romantic, and we might easily call modern, as it appears not on the grounds of art's presumed historical closure, but rather from within its incompletion, and as such it points toward a temporality proper to art, rather than to a history in which it would appear more simply contained. And at the same time it points to this temporality, there is no other way to point to it, from a particular moment within it. The underlying thought here is that art, insofar as it continues to appear as art, continues, that is, to be an essential moment of thought, is what necessarily appears as suspended between its two ends, between its classical sculptural achievement and its romantic, painterly, dispersed dissolution, and thus exists in curious relationship both to its own standards and to what it can claim as its history. As an idea about art, this is very close, I think, to Nancy's claims that the history of art is a history that withdraws at the outset. One could say art is each time radically another art, not only another form, another style, but another essence of art, but it is at the same time, each time, all that it is. This time, the time these lectures take or wager as ours, is the one generally characterized as post-minimalist, and any attempt to make out its particular shape, its urgencies or necessities, and its risks or failures continues to be obliged to make its way through the narrow defiles of Michael Fried's 1967 notorious and notoriously difficult essay, Art and Objecthood. The notoriousness has a lot to do with how it brought to full boil questions already worked up to a considerable simmer by Clement Greenberg. Questions on the order of, how dare Fried claim to speak for me in this way? Who is he to tell me what I should care about? And this is clearly linked to what is perhaps most difficult in the essay itself, the way in which it is almost nothing but a sustained account of Fried's experience of certain works. That the temperature always rises so fast around it clearly has to do with the essay's strong polemic tone, but I suspect it has more finally to do with the particular further difficulty that most of those who raise the question about speaking for also accept Fried's account of his experience as answering well to their own. What they want for the most part is the right to conclude otherwise than Fried does, to come to a different judgment. As Thierry de Duve nicely puts this position, it suffices to follow Fried's analysis point by point while reversing its judgment of value. This, of course, takes it that art and objecthood has distinct moments of description or analysis on the one hand, and of judgment on the other. But there's no evidence of such structure to the essay, and so it seems natural to take the judgment as unearned, as mere prejudice. These two problems, about voice and about argument, are in fact intimately linked. One way to begin making this out is to pick up on a remark Hegel makes in the introduction to the lectures on fine art. Noting that we often have strong responses to art, Hegel points to the often arbitrary relation such reactions may have to the actual content of the work. Consequently, he writes, the investigation of the feelings which art evokes, or is supposed to evoke, does not get beyond vagueness. It is a study which precisely abstracts from the content proper and its concrete essence and concept. For reflection on feeling is satisfied with observing subjective emotional reaction in its particular character, instead of immersing itself in the thing at issue, i.e. in the work of art, plumbing its depths, and in addition relinquishing mere subjectivity and its states. But in the case of feeling, it's precisely this empty subjectivity which is not only retained, but is the chief thing. And this is why men are so fond of having feelings. The withering closing phrase about why people are so fond of having feelings injects a wonderful acid note into what is often felt as Hegel's relentless dryness, and an alert reader may recall other places where this tone suddenly shows through in Hegel, as, for example, in the Phenomenology's also introductory remark that the Absolute, quote, would surely laugh our little ruse to scorn were it not with us all along and of its own volition. While both these remarks are driven by the same underlying sense of the ways in which our experience can be lost to us, we probably have an easier time hearing the essential modernity of that sense in the aesthetics formulation. In the fondness for having feelings, one can recognize a variation on, even an early announcement of, a theme that runs throughout our dealings with the modern, and that has been variously posed in terms of attention and distraction, spectacle and boredom, and so on. Here I want to bring it into particular juxtaposition with a famous remark by Clement Greenberg. He writes, "We know what has happened to an activity like religion, which could not avail itself of Kantian immanent criticism in order to justify itself. At first glance, the arts might seem to have been in a situation like religion's. Having been denied by the Enlightenment all tasks they could take seriously, they looked as though they were going to be assimilated to entertainment pure and simple, and entertainment itself looked as though it were going to be assimilated, like religion, to therapy." This is one of those places where Greenberg gets something just right. And no small part of what he gets right has to do with his placing entertainment first and therapy second. There's more than one import this sequence can bear. One particularly interesting gloss would be loosely Foucauldian, and would note that what first enters as the indulgence of feeling ends as its disciplining. But any way of working through the sense of the sequence will have to come to grips with the way it charts a certain closing down onto the self as the shape of art's collapse. And sometimes we'll find ourselves having to struggle with our sense of this is not necessarily a bad thing, having perhaps to say or show why it should not count as a kind of liberation, and more particularly why it should not count as a gaining or regaining of access to what is, after all, always one's own experience. And that's, of course, why Hegel's acid may sting. Who is Hegel to speak this way of my attachment to my feelings? Where does he stand that allows him to correct or belittle what is mine, felt by me, and presumably so felt on the basis of a whole way I am in the world, a way that may well include all sorts of further ways in which I am imposed upon or stifled by that world, or even deprived of it in ways he cannot possibly know, but that may well include among their very mechanisms the immersing and plumbing he would oppose to the emptiness he imputes to me. These are, of course, also recognizable as the fundamental terms of a familiar protest against not only Greenberg or Fried, but against the critic in general. Who is he to tell me what to like, to tell me what I like, to speak for me? What we may have gained by our loop through Hegel is the recognition that these are not, in the first instance, questions about art or beauty or Greenberg's Kant, but about experience, its having and its voicing. It's true, though, that Hegel is aiming at the specific thing we've come to call aesthetic experience, and by the next paragraph it's a generalized Kantian version of this, quote, a peculiar feeling of the beautiful, a specific sense of the beauty, unquote, that's bearing the burden of his attack. It's notable that Hegel declines to use the word experience here, but continues to put the matter in terms of feeling. He has other stronger uses for the word experience, as for something more than an example in the Phenomenology's Spirit subtitle that I paused over in the first of these lectures, Science of the Experience of Consciousness, a phrase in which one ought to note both the conjunction of science and experience, as well as the ambiguity of the genitives throughout that permit one to read the whole phrase as a kind of unfolding of the core term, consciousness as less what we have an experience of than as what itself has experience as its essential dimension, so also experience as less what we might or might not have a science of than what itself has, or implicitly is, a kind of science. From here, we can get a good view of how Hegel means such words as abstract and concrete earlier in the remark about feelings. His most frequent synonym for abstract is one-sided, whereas concrete is his favored term for what is many-sided and is so because it is fully articulated. Freedom, imagined as something opposed to system, is abstract in this sense. Freedom as something that has a system, that is a complex, many-sided order of limits and institutions and discourses, has the shape of the world in which we have an agency we can claim as ours and doesn't appear as a flight from it. To be free is, in this sense, to be at home in the world, to find the world inhabitable. In a short piece entitled Who Thinks Abstractly, and intended for journalistic publication, Hegel offered the following example. "Old woman, your eggs are rotten," the maid says to the market woman. "What?" she replies. "My eggs rotten? You may be rotten. You say that about my eggs? You? Did not lice eat your father on the highways? Didn't your mother run away with the French? And didn't your grandmother die in a public hospital?" In brief, she does not leave one whole thread on her. She thinks abstractly and subsumes the other woman, scarf, hat, shirt, and so on, as well as her fingers and other parts of her, and her father and whole family too, solely under the crime that she has found the eggs rotten. This opens into Hegel's more pointed account of the ordinary enough reduction of the criminal to his crime. This is abstract thinking, to see nothing in the murderer except the abstract fact that he is a murderer, and to annul all other human essence in him with this simple quality. If abstractness of this sort appears to amount to mere subjectivity, the concrete objectivity Hegel opposes to it, whether the grasp of the murderer is a particular person who has done a particular thing in an equally particular context, or plumbing the depths of the work of art, does not so much take the form of setting that subjectivity aside, as it does that of asking it to take its object and occasion, but so also itself, seriously. The phenomenology's introduction puts this in terms of what is and is not serious about our moments of skepticism, arguing that such moments are not to be defeated or otherwise set aside, but to be entered into and entered into in detail. What is refused is the step by which one permits oneself to abstract from some particular failure of knowledge to a conclusion about the failure of knowledge overall, a move in which we allow our experience, its particular occasions and objects and consequences, to be lost on us. That this loss may feel like a way of saving ourselves, or at least the odd privilege of our subjectivity, from the general wreckage of knowledge, tells us something about the motives to such abstraction. Fear of truth, Hegel calls it, and he's far from saying that such fear is groundless or unwarranted. What he opposes to abstract subjectivity will, in fact, repeatedly transform it beyond recognition. As he puts it later in the introduction, this exposition of the course of experience contains a moment in virtue of which it does not seem to agree with what is ordinarily understood by experience. The preface is rather more dramatic. The life of spirit is not the life that shrinks from death and keeps itself untouched by devastation, but rather the life that endures it and maintains itself in it. Such transformation beyond recognition is what Hegel means by experience, and so brusquely opposes to the having of feelings and the fondness for such having, a having that amounts to nothing more than self-possession, and that is maintained at the cost of the experience those feelings do not yet constitute, but are nonetheless held to count for. Experience, in a passage I cited in the first lecture, is the name we give to just this movement, in which the immediate, the unexperienced, the abstract, becomes alienated from itself, and then returns to itself from this alienation, and is only then revealed for the first time in its actuality and truth. I've said art and objecthood is almost exclusively an account of Freud's experience. What in the essay that is not simply or directly that is a series of appeals to accounts of the artist's experience, and these are typically not made in order to argue with those accounts. Indeed, Fried takes them to be pretty accurate, things that both help him articulate his own experience and offer some reason not to think that experience peculiar to him alone. He doesn't, in this sense, have any argument with Donald Judd, Robert Morris, Diane Flavin, Tony Smith, and the others, but he's nonetheless at odds with them. The difficulty of the essay lies almost entirely in making this out right. The most extended version of what appears to be Fried's perverse affirmation of the artist's account of the work he condemns comes when he cites at some length Tony Smith's account of his evidently seminal experience on the unfinished New Jersey Turnpike. The passage is familiar enough, but it's useful to have it once again in front of us in order to see just what Fried reads in it. When I was teaching at Cooper Union in the first year or two of the 50s, someone told me how I could get on to the unfinished New Jersey Turnpike. I took 3 students and drove from somewhere in the meadows to New Brunswick. It was a dark night, and there were no lights or shoulder markers, lines, railings, or anything at all except the dark pavement moving through the landscape of the flats, rimmed by hills in the distance, but punctuated by stacks, towers, fumes, and colored lights. This drive was a revealing experience. The road and much of the landscape was artificial, and yet it couldn't be called a work of art. On the other hand, it somehow did something for me that art had never done. At first, I didn't know what it was, but its effect was to liberate me from many of the views I had had about art. It seemed that there had been a reality there that had not had any expression in art. The experience on the road was something mapped out but not socially recognized. I thought to myself, it ought to be clear that's the end of art. Most painting looks pretty pictorial after that. There's no way you can frame it. You just have to experience it. What do we imagine a hostile critic might do with a passage like this? Smith's tale could, one supposes, be attacked for having nothing to do with the art it's supposed to explain or justify. It could equally be attacked for being an account of some kind of morally or aesthetically bad experience, giving rise to equally morally or aesthetically bad art. And presumably it could be claimed to be in some sense false or misleading, not really what happened to Smith at all, an effort at myth-making or something of that sort. Each of these, and probably others, can feel a little bit like what Fried does with the passage. The second is probably the most tempting, and the first probably least so, although in an odd way it may be closest to what Fried actually does. But the most straightforward description of Fried's procedure here is to say that he doesn't in fact attack the passage at all, only affirms it. Here's what he says. What seems to have been revealed to Smith that night was the pictorial nature of painting, even one might say the conventional nature of art, and that Smith seems to have understood not as laying bare the essence of art, but as announcing its end. There was, he seems to have felt, no way to frame his experience on the road, no way to make sense of it in terms of art, to make art of it, at least as art then was. Rather, you just have to experience. As it happens, as it merely is. The experience alone is what matters. There's no suggestion that this is problematic in any way. Fried makes no argument with the passage except to underline the one that it already is with itself. Smith reports that the experience had nothing to do with art, and Fried works to render that audible to the reader in a way it evidently was not to Smith himself. And if Smith goes on to make things that mean to repeat or capture this experience, this nothing to do with art, it is in effect enough for Fried to say that those works do indeed do just that. He calls this difference not exactly between himself and Smith, but between Smith and himself, that is, between Smith's words and his hearing of or attending to them, or between his hearing of them and our reading of them, a difference in sensibility, a word probably best heard with its somewhat older emphasis on a kind of alert receptivity, rather than as a more direct marker of something like posture or position or mood. To put it at its baldest, Smith thinks he's had an experience and that certain things follow from that. Freed thinks that Smith has in fact not had his experience, and that the words that are the evidence of that are that evidence just because they are the means of his not having, of his blocking himself from that experience, his refusal of its articulation. Tony Smith, one can imagine, already feels something a lot like this. Likely feels that the words he's obliged to put to what happened to him fail the event. But Freed's point runs just the other way. The words don't fail the experience, Smith fails his words, and in failing them, fails the experience. The work is the continuation and monumentalization of that failure, meant and unmeant in the same way Smith's words are meant and unmeant, withdrawn from themselves. In the dance of protesting reader outside the text and artist critiqued within it, one can begin to hear inside, how dare Michael Freed speak for me, a deeper fear or anger finding different words. How dare you listen to me? And it won't be hard to imagine Freed answering, if you can't offer your words seriously, that is, as there for me to hear, what am I to say to you? And what are you to do with yourself other than hold fast to its emptiness? And this is, of course, also to say, if you can't offer your art seriously, that is, as there for me to see, what is there for me to offer an account of or a judgment upon? Why should I make myself party to your play acting? The failure or refusal to have one's experience is itself both a particular moment within our experience and one of its permanent general dimensions. Experience, we might say, everywhere betrays itself, just is both its giving away and its own evidencing. This means, among other things, that Freed is not, at this point, simply free to walk away from Smith's work or words, but is obliged to take up the challenge of Smith's words just where Smith himself declines it. The next paragraph thus begins, but what was Smith's experience? And works to show how that experience was one of a closing down onto the self, its reduction to subject, that cannot but be its own bafflement. And I quote, the object is, so to speak, replaced by something existing for Smith alone and for those in the car with him. It is the explicitness with which the experience presents itself as directed at him from outside that simultaneously makes him subject, and establishes the experience as something like that of an object, or rather of objecthood. Freed is, I'd say, too generous in including the others in the car. It seems to me important about Smith's story, particularly from Freed's point of view, that they are no sooner mentioned than they drop out. The experience remains Smith's alone. There are at least a couple of interesting ways of characterizing Freed's work here. A first characterization, which touches on some of the terms in which other critics and historians have wanted to make a more positive claim for minimalism, would entail recognizing Smith's experience as participating in some variation of Kant's sublime, as an experience of unboundedness that drives its witness back onto hitherto unavailable resources of the self. Freed, one can imagine, might accept this as far as it goes, but would crucially note that the originality thus discovered and claimed still remains open in Kant to the distinction between sense and nonsense, or between opening a path for imitation and simply standing apart as an assertion of sheer irrecuperability. We've seen Sarah having to wrestle with this, but in his case it emerges as an issue within the work rather than the work submerging as an evasion of it. A part of the interest of this characterization is that it shows something about both how far the formalism we attribute to Freed is already caught up in a transition toward the more complex position of Hegel, and how far minimalism forces that transition to explicitness. The one that I think most interests Freed and more or less systematically informs the whole of art and objecthood is that this shows the experience of art must have been for Smith, for his experience to count as a revelation of sorts. One crude way to put this would be to say that Smith must always have taken painting as something that mattered because of what was concealed behind it, say its meaning, and that art was in this sense something to be seen through, or, if impenetrable, then something withheld from us. What Smith makes is just that withholding. That's Dye's hollowness, its turn away from the aspirations of sculpture and its claims on art. Smith and Fried can presumably point to many of the same works or objects in justification of their positions, but they will nonetheless not be pointing to the same things. As Fried puts it, literalist sensibility is, therefore, a response to the same developments that have largely compelled modernist painting to undo its objecthood, more precisely the same developments seen differently, that is, in theatrical terms. Fried's argument is then not a laying out of evidence in view of reaching some evaluative conclusion. In the end, it is best thought of as a demonstration of Dye, the way I might demonstrate a fancy corkscrew for you, showing you what it does, lift a cork, and how it does so. Pressing down on these handles engages the rings that then cause the shaft of the screw to lift up. If I've done all this, and you still want to call the thing a pair of scissors, and insist on trying to cut paper with it, we've got a funny kind of problem that is less like an argument than it is like a failure to share a language or a life. I suppose one might equally say that it's like demonstrating that the corkscrew is broken by showing how the gears fail to engage where they should, and then you're responding by proceeding to put it on futile work on bottle after bottle, and claiming that you have nonetheless opened them. Here, too, it'll feel like we're divided by something that's not exactly an argument, although certainly one of my feelings will be something like the force of argument is simply lost on you. But of course, no matter how clarifying that analogy may be, it's not a matter of corkscrews, but of something we call art, on no ground other than our experience of it. With the corkscrew, I'll be pretty quickly driven to the conclusion that you are, one way or another, alien, someone whose form of life is just closed to me in ways I can't fathom. Perhaps you're mad, perhaps you're a zombie or a Cyberman, or you may be a child whose lively imagination I will be happy to play along with for as long as it lasts. It's considerably less clear where or how our minimalist case is to find its end. In principle, the bottom line remains the same. There's something sufficiently deeply unshared between us that our relationship itself is in question, and Fried pushes his case strongly toward that limit, which is no doubt the deepest cause of the anger it so often provokes. In fact, of course, that's not how things actually play out, and the rejection of Fried typically turns on one's tacit acceptance of some form of institutional theory of art that separates one's experience of the work from one's judgment of it and effectively renders the one irrelevant to the other. The institution, in effect, tells one what to make of one's experience. The most influential version of this theory is undoubtedly Arthur Danto's soft Hegelianism, which I call soft because for Danto the subject is never in question. Art's history, such as it is or was, is solely a matter of exhausting its predicates to the point that one lays bare the actual truth that has been there all along. In practice, the distinctions between this and more straightforwardly sociological or apparently personal accounts don't count a great deal, and on pretty much any version of this view, one will take art and objecthood, as James Meyer does in his important book on the emergence of minimalism, as a pivotal moment in what one will then very likely call the cultural construction of minimalism. What I primarily want to stress is the difference between this and seeing art and objecthood as, in Hegel's sense, a proof of minimalism, a showing of what minimalism is that unfolds it to the point of its own proper disproof, without thereby actually disposing of it, because it is, after all, also its proof, which is why we cannot simply reverse its judgment as Deleuze suggests, or simplify that proof and disproof into a work of cultural construction. But this is also why we can't simply embrace Freud's judgment, even if we imagine ourselves wholly in accord with it. What minimalism proves to be, I suggest, is the baffled incipience of art, the place where Hegel's symbolic and architectural runs up directly against his romantic or modern, with no possibility of dialectical mediation. Diagram-prone as I am, I find I can't write this without recalling Lacan's transformation of his fundamental schema R so as to graph the effects of the foreclosure of the signifier in the case of the psychotic Schreber. Although I don't really know what to do with this diagrammatic itch, it seems to me suggestive enough to be worth showing. In any case, I take this direct encounter of the symbolic and romantic in the absence or impossibility, the permanent pastness of the classical, to be the fundamental shape of the contemporary, of this time. In this sense, art and objecthood's real work is to lay out a condition, one crucial dimension of which is given as a deep uncertainty about the very grounds and possibility of judgment, the shape of a world, our experience of it, and what we are or are not able to make of that experience. That's presumably why the essay ends as it does. This essay will be read, Freud writes, and we can now say 50 years later repeatedly has been read, as an attack on certain artists and critics and as a defense of others. And of course it is true that the desire to distinguish between what is to me the authentic of art of our time and other work has largely motivated what I've written. In these last sentences, however, I want to call attention to the utter pervasiveness, the virtual universality of the sensibility or mode of being that I have characterized as corrupted or perverted by theater. We are all literalists most of our lives. Presentness is grace. As with Hegelian proofs in general, we don't simply stand outside this demonstration, so that what Freud must in some sense want of his readers is something we may as well call conversion, a turning about of how we stand within our experience that will amount to a new or renewed inhabitation of our world, say a recovery of it, as if our current posture were to stand at once within it and turned away from it. This particular phrasing of the issue opens toward the conversations with the philosopher Stanley Cavell that deeply inform art and objecthood in ways that have been explored at some length in the literature, and that I'm not going to enter into again today, except to the extent of noting where Cavell, worrying at the status of the philosopher's voice, crosses paths with Hegel. Quoting Cavell, "But it is no easier to say who speaks for all men than it is to speak for all men. And why should that be easier than knowing whether a man speaks for me? It is no easier than knowing oneself and no less subject to distortion and spiritlessness. If philosophy is esoteric, that is not because a few men guard its knowledge, but because most men guard themselves against it." That last sentence turns us with surprising directness back to the place from which these lectures set out. Cavell's point is that no guarantees in philosophy or criticism can be offered in advance of the trying of one's voice. Hegel's version is aimed more particularly at the Kantian idea of a preliminary epistemological critique that it would ensure philosophy against falling into error. And so Hegel writes, "Should we not be concerned as to whether this fear of error is not just the error itself? This fear takes something, a great deal in fact, for granted. Above all, it presupposes that the absolute stands on one side and cognition on the other, independent and separated from it, and yet is something real. Or in other words, it presupposes that cognition which, since it is excluded from the absolute, is surely outside the truth as well, is nevertheless true, an assumption whereby what calls itself fear of error reveals itself rather as fear of truth. With this, Hegel is trying to persuade his presumably more or less Kantian reader to a certain turning about, a certain conversion. And it is still a difficult conversion. Most of us find it hard, for example, not to take Hegel's absolute, which he has glossed to this point simply as that which truly is, as a special and, so to speak, very big object, and so also to take absolute knowledge as naming a kind of knowledge distinct from other kinds of knowledge because not relative to anything else. That is, we're inclined to take knowledge in its absoluteness as knowledge that has taken everything into account, and will want to take this as meaning that it is nothing outside of it. That can't be entirely wrong. It captures in some way a whole bundle of Hegelian remarks that open onto the widespread sense of Hegel's claims as totalizing, which we then see as perniciously depriving us of world and possibility just when and as their delivery is claimed, and so finally offering us not the actual terms of our freedom, but a radical imprisonment that a whole tradition of post-Hegelian thought, Marx and Kierkegaard, Nietzsche and Bataille, appears to set itself utterly against. These are not pictures or intuitions one ought simply to set aside. They touch too closely on our recurrent sense that the world as we have it, may prove intolerable. But they're also importantly wrong. The absolute is less the name of a thing one might or might not gain possession of, or of a place to which one might or might not gain entry, than it is a qualification of something. It's better to hear it as a verbal adjective than as a noun. That is, to hear in absolute its origin is the past participle of absolve, so that one will also hear in Hegel's gloss what truly is, the weight falling on the truly rather than the what is. Absolute knowledge is not, or not exactly, a special knowledge distinct from other knowledges, so much as it is knowledge entered into a particular relation to itself, become absolved, acquitted or relieved of itself, become continuous with the articulation of its object, the articulation of the world. In this sense, absolute knowledge is not knowledge that gets everything right. It's more nearly a matter of everything having gotten right with, or made a certain peace with, itself. As Jean-Luc Nancy puts it, exposition and explication make themselves part of the real, and are the movement of being in itself and for itself. Exposition, explication, or interpretation is, and now he quotes Hegel, the self-exposition of the absolute and the display of what is. The goal of philosophy for Hegel, as it is for Heidegger and Cavell's Wittgenstein, is that we should find ourselves at home in the world, find the world to be ours. And so the deepest stakes of philosophy turn not on knowing, but on the recognitions or acknowledgments we find ourselves called to or capable of. And of course, no small part of that being at home in the world turns on whatever peace we have made or can make with the terms of our expression or articulation of it, thus also, as we've seen, with what art thinks or works through of those terms, and what remains unsettled or unfinished in that thinking. These lectures unfold within that lack of settlement, in a time, as Sarah might have it, of the absolute more or less, whereas art's ending is continually shadowed by its mere incipience, and in which we are pledged to reading as we are to criticism. Hegel writes in the Phenomenology that the evanescent itself must be regarded as essential, not as something fixed, cut off from the true and left lying who knows where outside it, any more than the true is to be regarded as something on the other side, positive and dead. Appearance is the arising and passing away that does not itself arise and pass away, but is in itself, and constitutes the actuality and movement of the life of truth. The true is thus the bacchanalian revel in which no member is not drunk, yet because each member collapses as soon as he drops out, the revel is just as much transparent and simple repose. He puts the same point more simply in the Encyclopedia. The spirit is not something in repose, but on the contrary, absolutely restless. And it's notable that repose and restlessness are opposed in this sentence, just in a way they are not in the longer passage from the Phenomenology, as if the very lability of that opposition were its point. Nancy, reading this sentence from the Encyclopedia, would have you hear absolutely as if it just meant restless. That is, as if the reading consisted solely in the assertion of a simple appositive comma, redistributing the weight of Hegel's sentence so as to track at once the thought and its weight as the impropriety proper to it, absolutely. In this, it offers a certain model for self-criticism, and I'd say it's a substantially richer one than can be derived from Greenberg's distinctly uneven appeals to Kant. Stanley Cavell has written of Hegelian argument as a mode of criticism called forth by the ways in which the self gets in its own way. And I take it that Nancy's implicit repunctuation of Hegel is an act of just such self-criticism, Hegel falling at once within and beyond himself. Hegel's thought is, Nancy writes, a matter of letting the absolute expose itself, and its implicit demand is that one not give up on the inscription of the absolute in the present, such that no present, whatever its form, past, present, or to come, is absolutized, that one not give up on the ongoing proof of experience. And again he writes, the present, Hegel's as much as our own, and Hegel's that ours perhaps completes, erects no overarching figure. It is what each time is for itself, the grasping of its passage, which means at the same time self-affirmation and the restlessness of the other. So can only ever be revealed, quote, as the restlessness opened up between the twilight of a fulfillment and the imminence of an upsurge. The present, this time, is a moment like any other, and at the same time has its shape and not another, is the particularity of its passage. I've tried in this lecture to bring out something at least of how minimalism punctuates a certain this time, and so also something of how our stakes are set out in its proof. For all that we might still want some definitive settlement of its controversies, there's no more to be had than what is given in them, so it is and is not enough to have worked them through. One of Aesop's fables tells of a man who makes a great show of training for the pentathlon while never actually getting any good at it. He then goes off for traveling for a while, and when he comes back home, he boasts a lot about his athletic successes elsewhere, and particularly about having made such a jump in Rhodes that not even an Olympic champion could equal it. And he adds that he could produce witnesses if they ever came to his country. Then one of the bystanders speaks up. But if this is true, my friend, we have no need of witnesses. Here's Rhodes, make the jump. Both Hegel, and following him Marx, push this punningly out of Greek and through Latin, finally into German. Here is the rose, here dance. For Hegel, this means that philosophy arrives always too late to teach the world what it ought to be. What remains is what is. For Marx, these same words bespeak the moment at which the conditions themselves cry out for revolution. We do not, either way, choose the present. What is asked of us is its unfolding. That is, of course, a speculative sentence. There's a wager in it.